Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Supporting Carers to Participate in the Workforce. My name's Elaine Katrakis and I'm the CEO of Carers New South Wales, and I'm really pleased to host today's session on behalf of the Carer Knowledge Exchange. So this is the second in a new series of webinars that have been coordinated by the Carer Knowledge Exchange, and I'll talk about that a little bit further on. Just to note for everybody, this session is being recorded. It's being hosted in webinar format, and I think we're all getting used to that after a couple of years now. Any questions or comments can be recorded through the Q&A icon in the middle of the control panel at the bottom of your screen, or by using the chat box. So I'd like to start off on behalf of the Carer Knowledge Exchange and the team by paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm presenting today, which is in North Sydney, and it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to extend those respects to the lands where all of our panellists and participants and attendees are located today, and I acknowledge Elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal people, including Aboriginal people joining us today, but also bearing in mind all of the Aboriginal carers that we work to support across New South Wales and across the country. So today's session, a little bit about the Carer Knowledge Exchange. It's a new project and partnership that's delivered by Carers New South Wales and the Institute for Public Policy and Governance at the University of Technology, and it's funded by the New South Wales Government, by the Department of Communities and Justice. It's a great new project that really has been underway since basically October last year, and it aims to draw together a really wide audience, including, importantly, carers, researchers, policymakers and practitioners, to connect the latest evidence about caring into practice so that we can collectively improve the outcomes for carers. When we talk about carers, we're talking about those people that are caring for a family member or a friend who might live with a disability, a mental health condition, might be ageing, might be frail. So it's that informal care. So it doesn't include paid care workers or the paid care workforce, which is also very important at the moment. So this webinar is part of a series of Carer Knowledge Exchange events focusing on carers' financial wellbeing and economic opportunities. It's also a key focus area of the New South Wales Government's New South Wales Carers Strategy, and one of the key priorities up there, priority 3, is on your screen. So this follows on from our last webinar, which was in November 2021, which focused on supports for carers in the workplace. All Carer Knowledge Exchange webinars are recorded and shared via the Carers New South Wales YouTube channel, and the direct link to the last session is included on the slide, as you can see there. So our presenters today. These webinars are designed to feature a range of evidence, and including, importantly, lived experience, research and best practice, to inspire a genuine and greater understanding of key issues facing carers. So today we will be first hearing from a carer, Vanessa Chan, about her experiences of balancing caring for a family member and paid work, followed by a brief presentation from a researcher, Myra Hamilton from the University of Sydney. The practice side of today's webinar will involve a series of discussion questions to inspire new research and practice in the challenging areas of recruitment, something that I think everybody is challenging and challenged by at the moment. So we hope that this session will stimulate conversation, innovation and collaboration to address some of the different barriers that carers experience, sustainably balancing their caring responsibilities with paid employment. So as this session is in webinar format, attending videos are not visible, but we will be encouraging interaction through the webinar via the Q&A function in the chat box. There'll also be a series of poll questions launched on your screen throughout the webinar. These are aimed at getting everyone involved and capturing some of the different perspectives that we have out there on the issues discussed. So we encourage you to participate if you can, and we'll make it clear when these are open for a response. There will also be an opportunity in the discussion section for attendees to virtually raise their hand if they would like to speak. In fact, we're going to start off with a poll question right now to give you and us a feel for who's in the audience, what your key interests are. So you should see a small poll question come up on your screen, and if you can quickly respond, that would be fantastic. So I am now very pleased to introduce our first speaker today, Vanessa Chan. Vanessa will be starting us off with a carer perspective, highlighting the centrality of carers' lived experiences to the Carer Knowledge Exchange. As Vanessa is speaking, if you have any questions or if anything comes to mind, please feel free to post these in the Q&A function or the chat box, and we can come back to them for later discussion. So welcome, Vanessa. If you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your experience of balancing caring and paid work. Thanks, Vanessa.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Carers New South Wales for inviting me to participate in the session today. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, people of the Eora Nation. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking about this issue today with the permission of my daughter. So Sarah has asked me to speak about my experience as a carer and what that's meant for my working life. I haven't spoken about this before, and so my thoughts may not be very well developed and a bit messy, but I'm sure that you will all be able to make sense of it. And I'm really here today just to share my experiences. So I'll set the scene. I have 3 beautiful adult children, 29 to 23. They are wonderful. Currently, I have my eldest and my youngest living with me. My youngest is studying. My eldest is a musician and kicking off a social work degree, career. And my middle child lives and works in Melbourne, but she visits a lot. So we're a very close family. And my eldest daughter, amongst a lot of other things about her, lives with acute bipolar 1. So in relation to our family, I am mostly a mum. At times, a fair bit of the time, I'm a worried mum. I have periods of being an informal carer. And then due to the acute and episodic nature of my daughter's illness, at times I am her legally designated carer. So my gorgeous daughter and her illness, she developed anxiety in her early 20s, which was a very challenging period for her. She's incredibly self-aware, and so she linked herself up with Headspace and received counselling. During this period, these early years, she put herself through 2 university degrees, an arts degree and a social work degree. She teaches music, and in lots of ways, her life was going really well, but she certainly did have an underlying level of distress. After a couple of years, as her condition declined, she was diagnosed with psychosis, which is a bit of a catch-all diagnosis on early presentation, and put on a roller coaster of antipsychotics. By her mid-20s, her condition became more acute, and she was committed to Marie Bashir at RPA, and then began a very intense and continuing relationship that we've had, particularly her, but all of us as a family, with the health system. So over the last 6 or 7 years, she's had 3 hospitalizations. That's a little bit of the context, one aspect of our family life. In terms of my working life, I have been a very successful senior public servant, holding executive management roles in local government, including almost a decade in CEO roles. Work has been a really important part of my life and my family's life. My children, my then partner, my broader family and friendship networks have always been really incredibly proud of me. And I think it's not until you step away that you realise how important that identity, that connection, and that sense of self actually comes from work. So I'm really pleased that this is an area of discussion for Carers New South Wales. Most of my working life, during most of my working life in my carers role, I was just a mum, and a mum with a very active dad in the picture. But as a mother in the workplace, there's already a layer of challenge, balancing competing demands, energy and effort in doing all of these jobs, as well as trying to make a little bit of space for yourself. But there's a lot of public discourse about this and about being a parent in the workplace, being a mother in the workplace in particular. And that allows us to talk about it, to make sense of it, to learn from each other in the community, in the workplace, and in the world. This is not the context for more formal caring, and certainly not in the mental health space. I hadn't had any personal experience of mental illness in my family or friendship network. And remembering that this for me commenced about 10 years ago, it was not something that was discussed or understood. It was not something that I had any real knowledge about. And so whilst everyone experiencing a mental illness is different, it is not uncommon for many people, and those of us who love them and care for them, to be dealing with a whole web of issues related to their illness. Issues like polydrug use, violence, sexual abuse, criminal activity, self-harm, suicidal ideation, lack of basic self-care, hanging with the wrong crowds, refusal of medication, terrible side effects from medication, involvement with the police. Now, thankfully in our family, we haven't experienced all of these things, but we certainly have experienced many of them. And it can be consuming. For me, at this point, I probably would say there's a 6-month run, which happens every couple of years, where we see a decline in health, traumatic hospitalisation admittance, and support with recovery. So the timing of the onset of my daughter's illness converged with a range of other things. And a significant part of this was a change in the leadership, values, and work culture expectations in my organisation, which had shifted to becoming not at all open to any of this discussion. To be honest, it was bad enough that I was a woman doing a man's job. They were not remotely interested in having any discussion, let alone creating any flexibilities around my needs as a carer. So there were a range of other things going on in my life at that time and in our family at that time. So I decided to leave work, and I haven't gone back to the sector. Now, I fully recognise how privileged I am that I could do this and focus on my family for a whole year. Financially, I was able to do that, both by the nature of the work I do, and in this aspect of our lives, and my role as a carer came to us when we were actually a lot more established, as my daughter didn't kind of present with her illness until she was in her early 20s. But I've had to reinvent a different kind of working life for myself, one that has a very high level of flexibility, something that allows me to come in and out of work easily. It's really important to me that I surround myself with people and organisations that are culturally very inclusive. And so what happened for me, having been a very traditional state, public sector, senior executive, very driven and focused person, I moved out of that space and into consulting. At that time, I hadn't geared up for it, and I hadn't ever expected that this would be a professional choice that I would make. I found setting up a business to be no easy feat. I was now working in the private sector for the first time, the insecurity in tenure, difficulties in being able to plan, and a very significant drop in income were things that I experienced really for the very first time and that I hadn't really anticipated. During COVID, there was no work. Having said that, I think that choice for me to leave full-time paid employment and move into a different kind of work was the right option for me. To be honest, I also just didn't feel like I had very many choices. Now, this is not a sad story. I'm actually in a really, really good place now. I have hugely exciting work, and I'm working in an organisation which is and a team which is incredibly connected, inclusive, and just fabulous. But it was a really hard journey, and it didn't have to be that hard. And I think we can make it better. And I don't want others to have to walk the difficult path that I did. So in thinking about this, and I'm mindful that, it's always important to take a strength-based approach. So I've put my mind to what are some of the things that I think would have made it easier. And I started doing that by first thinking, what have I learned out of this? And I've been thinking about the culture of work. The demand on hours, the expectation that we be singularly focused on the job at all times, at all cost, is very reflective of a masculine culture in most Australian workplaces. I feel that we really need much more discourse around the balance of work and life. It's so important for us to talk about this. And I think the onus is on the workplace to enable that and to translate it into action. In reality, we spend so much time at work, whether we like it or not, it is the site in which a lot of other things play out. Carers need to work, and many, many, many workers are carers. So I think if we can name it, and think about how we support them, this is a very important first step. It is a very silent and isolating role currently in the workplace. So I think opening the floodgates and having discussion is really important, particularly important around mental health. There is an enormous amount of stigma associated with mental health. As a carer, there is all of that stuff around, if you're a carer, but you're a carer of someone with a mental health issue, oh, well, you mustn't have parented properly. There's an enormous lack of knowledge and understanding of what caring for someone with a mental illness looks like. And this knowledge is not just for everybody else, it's actually for us as carers as well. I had never felt so hopeless, so disempowered, lost, or responsible as I have had in this space. Sorry, let's take a moment. But I'm in a much better place now. And I think one of the things that's been really important is that I've linked into the One Door Carers Support Network. But I will say to you, it took me 7 years to find them out, which is a long time in isolation. And it's also really difficult to recognise what is caring in the mental health space. So the nature of the care, it's not physical, place-based, constant. It's episodic, it's unpredictable, it's immediate, and it's very much about emotional and cognitive overload. Although that last bit probably refers to a whole range of experiences people have as carers. So what would I like to see happen? What kind of things could we put in place to make it easier? I think well-being and inclusion in agendas in the workplace are really positive hooks for this dialogue. If we name it and count it, we can learn about it and we can do something about it. So we ask lots of questions of our staff in a non-mandatory way, about questions about cultural and linguistic background. Is there any reason why we can't ask, are you a carer? So that we have a sense within our organisations, in our businesses, what kind of demand and what kind of flexibilities we need to provide. If we listen, if we know that it's there, we name it and we don't make it shameful and we accept responsibility for it, we are then place ourselves in a position to be able to listen to the needs of carers with a bias to accommodate flexibilities where we can and where it's practicable. So inclusive approaches, they benefit the entire workplace, not just carers. But if we don't ask that question, and if we don't acknowledge that it is an aspect of people's lives who are working, in organisations, if we don't know our people, we're not going to be able to support them or get the best from them. So I think that, it's been interesting looking at the information and the discussion, the public discussion around mental illness and wellness during COVID. I think there's been a really significant escalation and profile of the importance of wellness and an attempt to destigmatise and de-shame that. And I'm hoping that this is the beginning of a very different kind of public agenda around mental health generally. But certainly the role of carers is not one of those ones that has come up, and I imagine, and I would be thinking, and it certainly was our experience in our family and my experience as a carer, that COVID was a trigger. And so we had a particularly acute and difficult time during that period. Fortunately, it was COVID, so I couldn't get any work. So I was available to be able to provide that level of care and support to my daughter and to our family. At a very practical level, I think looking to create networks of support around staff in workplaces is really important, and utilising things that are already in place. Most workplaces will provide access to employee assistance programs. Some workplaces offer EAP services, not just to staff, but in a limited sense to all of their families. So I think exploring those kind of provisions. Many awards will require workplaces to have EAP programs in place. So let's start doing some work on the things that are already around. I don't think I am unique in having made a decision to leave my career and my workplace in part because of my care responsibilities, and it was a much more complex situation than that, but having to leave, and certainly I would expect, in my sense of having spoken to other carers, is that we do have quite a lot of employment insecurity. So I think being able to offer transitional coaching and support programs for staff who are leaving the organisation is an important support that can be provided. Income support during periods when you can't work and you're in that full-time carer mode is really important. I will say this is next to impossible in the mental health space, because there really just isn't a recognition of what to be a carer in that environment actually looks like. So certainly my experience talking to other carers as well is that it's next to impossible to get income support during those periods or at all, and particularly for those who have much more sustained longer periods of care. And I think having the health system better recognise, involve and support carers is really important. There's a whole discussion to be had there about the exclusion, the dumping, the bad calls that happen in the mental health system. But what I will say about it is that if we are more supported, more involved at that point in and recognised as part of that network of support of the people that we love, it takes an enormous amount of stress, strain off us in the workplace and enables us to be more free to normalise our family and our working lives. It is incredibly difficult to have the energy and the headspace to be able to deal with work at the same time as you're battling the health system. Next to impossible.
If I can jump in there, Vanessa.
Yeah.
We've had a couple of questions come in as well. I think some of them you've already addressed. Thank you so much for your very open sharing and great information that you've provided. We've had a couple of comments to that effect as well. So we really appreciate the information you've provided. I think one of the questions you've probably already covered off on, but another one that's just come through, maybe you'd like to build on this, was what practical help did you receive or would you like to receive in the workplace? And so I guess, was there anything you wanted to add to that about things that were helpful for you?
Yeah, I mean, if I think about during the early period, it's very much been a journey, our experience. There wasn't a moment where it began and there won't be a moment where it stops. So there's been quite a pathway. In those very early days, the culture of my organisation was really important and the leadership in that organisation. So I was then reporting to someone at that stage who was very progressive, who was very open, was a woman, was very inclusive, and made me feel safe enough to be able to talk with her about what was happening and to seek then support from her. Is it okay? I'm going to take next week off. I really need to stabilize my daughter. I need to move her from one house to another house, or I want to go to the doctor's appointments with her. And then that was the culture of the organisation and the values of the organisation made that possible. That was not my experience at the time where her illness became very acute, and that was very much about a shift in the culture and values of the organisation. And there wasn't really any, because we had never had discussion there wasn't a recognition of one of the things about us as workers is that we might be carers. So there wasn't anything to hook it onto. There wasn't any HR policies that we could say, no, we've provided for this, and in accordance with that. It just gives you that basis from which to take a step to have a discussion about what you need. So I think having a policy in place, being really conscious of culture is important, but also then just having a recognition that there are carers, lots and lots of carers who are in workplaces, and we need to name it. I think that would be really important. I didn't utilise the EAP program. I used the kind of Medicare support. But essentially, I mean, my experience was that those first 5 years were enormously frightening. I was incredibly isolated. So I think if we have, and I was really at work most of the time. I worked very long hours. So it's at work that we need to be able to find out that information. So I think if we have, more of a focus on EAP and being able to say, you don't have to go to EAP if you're having just a problem with your boss. It's actually there to provide support to you in other aspects of your life as well. And I think a real promotion of that is important. But I also, so I mean, there's some kind of really practical things. I think if we know, and this, I think the point of entry here would be the health system. But if we were provided with information about where we can go as carers to get support, to get information, to get knowledge, to be able to actually engage in this whole new job. You've got a whole other job now. You're going to have to learn about, the Mental Health Act. You're going to have to understand what a tribunal is. You're going to have to understand, what does refusal to take medication, what is the implication of that? These are very daunting things to go on and processes to engage in on your own. If we're able to hook up with support very early on, a lot of that heat gets taken away so that you're actually able to go to work the next day instead of lying in bed saying, okay, I just have to wait till 3 o'clock so I can get back to this.
We've had a lot of people resonating, I think, with your comments in the chat box as well around use of EAP and some difficulties with system navigation. So thank you for those insights. We do have a couple more questions, but we want to make sure we have time for the rest of the content. So perhaps those that haven't had their questions answered, if you can maybe leave them to the end, and we'll hopefully come back to them. I'll pass back to Elena for now for our next speaker.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Vanessa. I think you've highlighted, and as have the comments, like really varying degrees of experience and responsiveness from workplace employers and health system and others around carers. And I think, at the core of that is in lots of those different aspects, whether it be through the EAP program, the workplace, it is about that recognition and then turning that recognition into like practical responses. And I think that recognition as a carer is fitting into some of those response things, particularly, in terms of some of the comments around EAP and people not seeing that as necessarily recognising the caring role. Others had a good experience, definitely, but I think it is that core back to that recognition within the workplace as well, and what that culture then does to address that. So thank you very, very much for sharing your story, and hopefully we'll come back to some of the other questions. Our second speaker today unfortunately had a last-minute meeting clash. So instead of presenting live, we pre-recorded a presentation yesterday and we'll share it to you via video. So Associate Professor Myra Hamilton is a researcher that currently works at the Centre of Excellence in Population Ageing Research at the University of Sydney. And we'll now hand over to Myra's pre-recorded session where she will introduce herself and present some slides on addressing barriers to workforce participation for carers from a research perspective. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Myra Hamilton. I'm a Principal Research Fellow at the Centre of Excellence in Population Ageing Research at the University of Sydney. Today I'd like to talk to you about a paper that I've written with my colleague Kathy Thompson at the University of New South Wales and with Sarah Judd-Lamb at Carers New South Wales on replacement care. So we know that carers face multiple barriers to participating in paid work, but few studies have attempted to understand how these barriers intersect. And as a result, policies aiming to address carers' employment tend to be implemented in isolation rather than in a holistic way. And one example of this is the treatment by governments of replacement care. Current approaches of replacement care, or care for a care recipient while a carer engages in other activities, tend to lack understanding of the interaction between the carer, their care context, and the labour market context. So in this paper, we aim to develop a more holistic approach for improving carers' employability. As you can see here on the left-hand side, over the last 3 decades, there has been a greater recognition of some of these barriers that carers face in employment. And there has also been greater investment in efforts to address some of those barriers in the policy and service landscape. And we put some of those examples on the right-hand side there. So, for example, carers experience challenges with their own health and well-being that affects their labour market participation. And we've seen investment in programs like carer counselling, peer support, and so on. Carers experience discrimination and lack of employer understanding. And so we've seen investment in things like Carer Recognition Acts, Anti-Discrimination Acts, and so on. These have been important, but they don't provide a holistic approach to supporting carers into work. And they rely on a problematic conception of replacement care, which tends to emphasise carer health and well-being only, rather than the broader set of barriers that carers face. This has been exacerbated by the changes to care services over the last 10 years towards more individualised funding in the NDIS and aged care package system. So care services now focus on the needs of the care recipient only. They don't recognise the interrelatedness of carer and care recipient needs in the same way. They're more difficult to navigate, and they're based on the assumption that these new service models will have a respite effect. By providing services to the care recipient, they'll reduce the demands of the caring role for the carer. And the assumption is that this will give carers more time for work and other things. The government has argued that better support for people with disabilities through the NDIS, for example, will provide such a respite effect that it will free up carers for work. The Carer Gateway is focused on carers' needs specifically, but at this stage provides fairly limited options when it comes to replacement care, or those extended periods of time of replacement care that carers require to participate in paid work. So we've decided to draw on an example of the Carers New South Wales survey data from 2020 to just unpack some of these claims that the NDIS frees up carers for work. So as we know, the NDIS provides individualised packages to people with a permanent and significant disability. But it does continue to rely on and encourage ongoing informal care arrangements. The NDIS may indirectly benefit carers, but carers can't access it in their own right. And so carers' employment needs are not necessarily included in NDIS planning. So when we look at the Carers New South Wales survey data, we see that while the NDIS is helping some carers to take a break, only 23% say it's actually helped them to stay in or go back to work. The survey also asked if the NDIS had changed the amount of time that carers spend organising care, and 67% said the time they spent actually increased. 27% said that it stayed about the same, and only 6% said that the time they spent organising care had actually decreased. So why are most carers saying that the NDIS is not enabling them to increase participation in paid work? Well, we argue in this presentation that these shifting landscapes in disability and also aged care services rely on an inadequate conception of replacement care. That is, an inadequate conception of what kind of formal care arrangements are required to actually enable a carer to prepare for and participate in work. As we've seen, more adequate or tailored services for the person with disability does not necessarily mean less time spent caring. Any extra time is mostly indirect respite, or bits of time for the carer while the person they provide care for is engaged in other activities. Most direct respite available for carers at this stage is based on what we call care time rather than work time. That is, it aims to provide a short break from their caring hours to have a rest, focus on their health and well-being, or participate in peer group activities. It doesn't provide appropriate time for work. That is, replacement care that provides regular, longer blocks of time tailored to working hours that is flexible when required. Not only is the NDIS underpinned by an inadequate conception of replacement care, but it sits within a broader carer service infrastructure that's not currently providing a holistic approach to supporting carers into work. Shortfalls in the NDIS when it comes to replacement care are unlikely to be at this stage fully compensated for in the Carer Gateway. So we argue that we need a rethink of replacement care, where the starting point is not taking a break from care, but rather what kind of time does an individual carer need to participate in work and other activities. We think this approach helps us situate what we currently have into a broader framework of what we need to build in order to improve carers' opportunities to participate in paid work. You can see that most of our policy and service efforts are focused on the left in this particular diagram here. Time to improve health and well-being, and a small amount in the middle, support for participation in education and training. But there's very little when we move over to the right-hand side there, time to be available to participate in work. So we think this is a useful framework for underpinning policy and service interventions to support the participation of carers in employment and other activities. So for example, if we're going to provide a peer support program or work with universities to provide flexible study options for carers, or to develop better support for job seeking, fundamentally, what kind of time will carers need to be able to participate? Like how many hours, how often, what times of day, and so on. Because that's the kind of replacement care that needs to accompany that policy or service intervention. So we think this kind of framework that focuses on the qualitative nature of the time required by carers to participate in different kinds of activities can help us move away from the notion of indirect respite, that any time is enough for carers, that dominates many of the policy discussions on consumer-directed care style disability services, towards a more holistic understanding of the kind of time that carers need. Finally, once we have adequate replacement care for carers to do these things, we still, of course, need to continue our important work towards creating carer inclusive workplaces. So in conclusion, we argue we should rethink the concept of replacement care that is more fit for purpose, moving beyond the limited view of respite as replacement care, being tailored to the needs of different times of time requirements that carers have, recognising that carers have different needs when preparing for or participating in employment, and continuing to invest in the importance of care-friendly or care-inclusive workplaces. Thank you.
Thanks, Myra. Just had a few questions for you. My first question was, you sort of mentioned the different areas of investment that government has looked at in supporting carers to overcome barriers to the workforce, but that there's a gap in a holistic approach to be taken. And so I guess I'd be interested in your perspective on what opportunities exist with the current service systems or investment programs to work towards a more coordinated and holistic approach to that care employment piece.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, definitely, I think that that within the existing service infrastructure, the Carer Gateway provides the best opportunity to develop that more integrated, holistic approach to improving carers' opportunities for paid work, because it really has the capacity to fund and provide services across a wide range of carers' needs and preferences. Certainly, though, I think there's more scope for finding ways to integrate the Carer Gateway with the other care support systems, where the NDIS and the Carer Gateway meet, for example, where the aged care system and the Carer Gateway meet, is where I think there's a lot more scope for work to bring together these different systems in understanding the interconnectedness between meeting the needs of the carer and meeting the needs of the care recipient.
Great, thanks for that. Another question as well, I guess coming from a slightly different perspective, you've spoken about the importance of having replacement care or respite services available that suit the employment and other requirements of carers. How can we also ensure that those replacement care services meet the needs of the people that are receiving care, ensuring that it's meaningful, quality, flexible to their needs? Yes. Are you advocating for a return to sort of a day centre type model, or is there a flexible, more innovative way we can do that?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot in that question. I mean, and again, I think part of the issue here is the disconnect between the service systems, because if we've got an NDIS that's focused on supporting the consumer's needs, and we've got the carer gateway focused on supporting the carer's needs, and what we need is replacement care that meets the needs of both, then it becomes very difficult to kind of bring them together in a holistic way. I think centre-based respite services are definitely a really important model, and we've done a project recently on centre-based daycare services or centre-based respite, and their great potential for meeting the needs of both the carer and the care recipient. And so definitely I think there's more scope for investment in that particular form of respite as a way of developing a model of care that both has the potential to provide the time that carers require to participate in paid work, while simultaneously being able to provide really holistic care that meets the needs of the care recipient. We know that those centre-based models can provide a really wide range of services that meet different support needs for people with disability and older people. So I definitely think that's one model worth looking at more closely.
Great, thank you. And just one final question. So you've mentioned the various types of government investment to address some of these issues and where there might be opportunities to integrate government-funded service systems. We're seeing increasingly innovative approaches at employer level, especially in large employers, to, I guess, use employer funds or look at other opportunities for funding and coordinating services that can assist carers to participate in work. Do you have any comments or thoughts about opportunities to resource these replacement care scenarios outside of government funding?
Yes, I have also heard of examples of really innovative practice at the employer level around either providing care services, replacement care services themselves, or providing or funding replacement care services, or providing kind of care brokerage or care coordination support that helps employees to access the replacement care they need to be able to participate in work, which has a really considerable impact on the capacity of their employees to balance work and care. And we see really positive outcomes in those limited examples that exist. So certainly I think there is scope, and I think that we're learning a lot more about the business case for employers when it comes to providing care inclusive workplaces. But I also think it's really essential for there to be a fundamental role for government also in investing in this kind of replacement care.
Thanks very much, Myra. We will hand back to the live webinar and pass on any questions that come up for you to respond to afterwards. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Sarah.
So thank you to Myra and to Sarah there for a few of those questions. There's a lot of different comments and things coming back through the chat with, support for integrating the systems, as long as there's that doesn't impact negatively on carers. And we are seeing already some of that start of integration, I think, between My Aged Care and the Carer Gateway. So there is some some thinking around that coming out of some of the other reports and things that have happened recently. So Sarah, I don't know whether you wanted to take on any other questions that might have come up in the chat from there.
I think we've pretty much covered it for now.
Okay, all right. So I'd like to thank Myra for that presentation and for doing that pre-record, which is great. We had a poll in the middle of that as well. So we'll move on to the next session as we've only got a short time left. So the next part of our webinar will be a little different. So rather than having one presenter with Q&A, we're just going to have a few slides with some prompts for some discussion. So it would be great if you can add your thoughts and perspectives to that discussion, again, either in the chat box or by posting or putting up your virtual hand, and we'll continue with a few poll questions in the time that we've got left. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah now to lead the discussion on the final section of our webinar today. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Elena. And it's been great to see lots of interaction so far in the comments. So I think some of the questions that I'm going to speak to have been discussed a little bit already, which is great. Means we may need a little less time than we had intended. So if we can just go to the next slide, please, Melissa. So we wanted to have a little bit of time to focus on the recruitment process, which has come up a little bit in the other presentations. And carer inclusive recruitment is something that a number of carers, researchers and employers have told us that they would like to know more about. And there isn't really much evidence out there about how to do this well for carers. So it's a perfect opportunity for the Carer Knowledge Exchange to generate more discussion about this and to hear from the audience today about where some of the gaps are and what might be possible. So I have a few slides with a little bit of information and some key questions to seek your input. And we may not be able to cover that in detail or have people speak today, but please do contribute your thoughts in the chat. We are saving that chat and we will be writing that up as we really value your input. So the first slide, I just wanted to address some of the common barriers that Carers New South Wales has seen in our research that carers report during the recruitment process. So from the Carers New South Wales 2020 National Carer Survey, we heard that carers often lack the skills and confidence they need due to time out of the workforce to land an interview or to perform well at interview. Not all carers, but many carers say that time out of the workforce has affected their confidence. They also feel uncertain about whether or not to mention that they're a carer during the recruitment process, whether it might work in their favour or work against them. And it's often unclear to carers when they look at job ads or have interviews whether the flexibility provisions that they need will be available. So I just want to go over now to you that are listening. Do those challenges sound familiar, and what other challenges have you come across? And that could be as a carer yourself or as someone that's been hiring staff in the past. So pop your thoughts in the chat about some of the recruitment process challenges. We've had one there around being able to only apply for part-time or casual work. Someone's mentioned stigma and age being a factor. Another vote for stigma there. Any other challenges that you have come across as carers or hiring managers in the recruitment process? Great, so we've got some support there for these challenges being addressed. Well, feel free to continue putting the challenges that you think are existing for carers in recruitment. We might move to the next slide in the meantime. One thing that we can do is look at insights from other contexts where inclusive recruitment has been assessed. So while there's not a lot of evidence-based practice and research on carer inclusive recruitment, there is a lot of evidence and best practice around diversity and inclusion in the workplace, including in recruitment and in the context of parents balancing caring for children and work. And so we've had a couple more comments come through there, which is great. Thank you for that. So just briefly speaking to some of these, we know that looking at training for staff, looking at policy changes in organisations, looking at how disability inclusive recruitment is done can be maybe applicable here. Also the concept of unconscious bias. So the fact that people might, so some people mentioned stigma before, maybe people have preconceived ideas about what carers can or can't do, or that might affect how they're perceived in the recruitment process. And then looking at as well how parents manage raising flexibility requirements during interviews and how that's managed. So we're going to just put another poll out specifically around bias and stigma because that's, I think, a really interesting area. So I think we'll just put that up now. So that's live if you want to respond to that. And then just looking at the chat as well, we've had some more comments come through about comfort disclosing the caring role, especially at the interview. That might be hard to do. And raising the importance of the benefit of caring to recruitment, which is definitely a really key point. And having the brain space to care and work is really important. So thank you for those comments. Does anyone else know of any concepts or practices in recruitment outside of caring that would be relevant to look at in research or in practice for carer inclusive recruitment? Do you have any suggestions there you're welcome to post those in the chat. And thank you for those poll responses. You can see that most people responding to the poll have observed bias or discrimination against carers during recruitment or in the workplace. So not good to hear, not surprising, but it's definitely an issue. So we might move through to the next slide then. For now, people can continue to add their thoughts in the chat. Carers and Employers program is a program that Carers New South Wales runs nationally. And last year they had a workshop, the Accredited Employers and Member Employers program, that focused on how to recruitment. So I just thought I'd include these points which came up as part of that conversation, some different ideas that thrown around to employers as to how they can have innovative initiatives to include carers. Apologies if I'm dropping out a little bit, must be my connection. So can anyone think of other things? Have you seen other things that work well to include carers in recruitment? If you can, please drop those ideas in the chat. And then I just wanted to launch another poll as well, which I think relates to some of the comments previously, about what your message would be to recruiters and hiring managers about carers. So these points here are things that have come out of Carers New South Wales research and consultation with carers, about valuing the skills that carers have, about understanding that flexibility doesn't mean a lack of commitment, about understanding the impact of career breaks on carers, but not writing them off for those career breaks. So just have a look at those statements. And if you could pick one of those things that you think recruiters and hiring managers should appreciate more or know more, let us know which you think is the most important. I know you might want to choose all of them, but pick your favorite or the highest priority one for you from your experience as a carer or someone that's hiring. So that's probably a pretty good place for us to finish up with in the discussion. Please keep adding in comments into the chat. And this is a conversation that we want to start as part of the Carer Knowledge Exchange, and that there will be opportunities to continue. So I just wanted to briefly end by pointing you to the 2022 National Carer Survey, where we will be asking some simpler questions. And so that is coming up in June and July this year. So if you keep an eye out for that, and if you have signed up for Carer Knowledge Exchange updates, you will get information about that. And if you have ideas about what we should ask carers or where there's gaps in the research in this area of recruitment, please do let us know, contact us, and raise these ideas so we can improve awareness and practice. So thank you very much for your interaction there. Sorry it was a little shorter than planned, and I'll hand back over to Elena.
Thanks, Sarah. And look, thanks for everyone for attending, for posting like really interesting comments, and for sharing your ideas, but also your experiences. It really makes it really important to understand all of those different, intersections where care and carers experience different things within the workplace. So thank you very much. Thank you to Sarah and Vanessa and Myra, and Vanessa in particular for sharing her personal story and caring story and balancing care and work and all of the challenges that she experienced there. So we've reached the end of the session. We've been recording today, as we've said, and we'll make the link available as soon as we can so that you can share that with your networks as well. There's some ideas on the slide up on the screen now about how you can continue interaction with the Carer Knowledge Exchange. So if you haven't already, you can subscribe and receive emails from the Carer Knowledge Exchange, and you can also find information about supports for carers there as well through Carer Gateway and Carers New South Wales, and the websites and numbers are up there on your screen. And I think we've just put up the final poll there as well. So I'd just like to thank everybody for your attendance today, and for the great comments, and we'll keep the conversation going. So thanks very much.